Yeah, what the hell is this episode?
Dude.
We have had no pre-chatter.
We've had no communication about the
we've had no communication about communication.
Welcome to No Clear Answers, where we explore the common challenges all humans, creators, and leaders face and break down preconceived notions of common self-help ideas. We are your hosts. I'm Ricky Goldenberg.
I'm Justin Mulvaney.
And I'm Dr. Corey Wilkes.
It's been a minute.
Yeah, the listeners and viewers won't have that experience, but we're having this experience. It has been a while since the three of us have all been with one another.
Look at us.
Just for fun, even, and also to record a podcast.
I know. Here we are. Let's talk about talking. That's what we're talking about today. Yeah? I love it. We're talking about communication today because we talk a lot, and we've been talking a lot about, being self-aware and having emotional intelligence and setting yourselves up for success and how do we communicate with others. And there's been this connective tissue. And one of our last times that we were hanging out, I got so insanely jazzed to talk about communication. And I was like, let's do an entire episode on it. And the two of you were like, what the fuck are we going to talk about talking? And I was like, I don't know. Spoiler alert, I still am quite unsure, but I feel like it's important. So let's dive in, friends. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Where are we beginning, Ricky?
I just have a couple of questions, and then we're going to see where this takes us. So, in the thread of communication, there was none before this. You were unprepared. We don't have any information of what we're coming into.
No, we really haven't been communicating lately.
No, because everyone's been traveling, and there's been things happening. We've all been very busy, I feel like. Corey launched his community. Justin, you were traveling. I had a human. Like, we've been busy, so we haven't been communicating, so this is all a surprise. So, my first question that I want to start, just to prime us, is what do we get wrong about communication? With the caveat of I want to think about communication in a couple different ways. Okay? Communication with our colleagues, the people that we work with, and our team. So in a work setting, what do we get wrong around communication? In a life setting, what do we get wrong around communication, which could be partners, family, friendship, and then in a personal setting with ourselves. So I kind of delineated it between these three different spaces, right? Work, life, self. We can play with that however we want, but I feel like the communication challenges are unique between all three, and we've touched on all of them in different flavors. So that's my question. What do we get wrong about communication in those areas?
That's a big, wide net of a question.
Because communication is so fucking wide.
Yeah. I have a seed, but not a collection of thoughts. Corey, I saw you typing. Do you have some thoughts to share off?
Sure.
I would like to listen first and then kind of marinate.
Sure. So the biggest thing for me when it comes to communication across, domains is really looking at the difference between your intention and the reception. Meaning, communication is less about what you say or how you say it, and more about what your audience hears or receives, right? And especially Rick, you talk about in life, right? So relationships are a very, very easy example of I said this, meaning this, but you heard this instead.
Mm-hmm.
And based on your perception of what you thought I meant off of my words, that is going to influence how you react to what I say, right? So a big part, especially with relationships just in general, platonic, romantic, familial, whatever, is what am I intending to mean before I even speak, What is the message I want my recipient to receive? How can I communicate that effectively? Right. And myself as an example, I tend to have a pretty flat tone, a very dry sense of humor. I come across as an asshole most of the time, and I accept that about myself. Like I don't give a shit. Character flaw or not, I don't give a shit. This is just how I am. And like the other day, my girlfriend and I, we were cooking or something, and I just said something like in a very matter of fact way, and she was like, basically, like, that was a really dickish tone. I was like, I accept that. I didn't mean it to be, and she's like, I know you didn't mean it to be, but your tone sounded judgmental. I was like, that's fair, right? So even though she recognized the intention behind what I was saying, and we communicate all the time, which helps, but she was like, at the same time, your delivery sucked, right? And I think a lot of times it's really easy for us to not pay enough attention about our delivery of our message when we're communicating, because we have a lot of assumptions, right? Like, everybody goes into a conversation with their own worldview that is separate from yours, right? We all have our own experiences, good and bad. We all have our own assumptions, our own perspectives, our own, sometimes low-key traumas we bring into conversations, right? And that most of the time is the root of conflict. There is a misalignment in how we are communicating. I meant to say this, but you heard this thing over here instead. But because we're not operating off of a shared perspective or shared definition, we're actually now having two different conversations, right? So that's my biggest thing when it comes to communication, is focusing less on what you're saying and more on how do I say it in such a way that it is appropriately received by the other person. And that means how you communicate is going to change based on your intended audience. That's what I have so far.
So, Corey, there were two thoughts. Your thing helped me see the underlying theme for me. And it kind of stems, if I piggyback off from you, I can ask the question, what makes it so somebody doesn't receive what you're saying in the way you intend for it to come across, right? So what causes the misfiring? And a common thing that I see is people don't actually communicate the root of the truth of what's going on for them. And I have a few recent examples that I want to share from my experience. So what I would say is, you're not actually saying the real thing, or you're not saying the thing from the real place that it's coming from. A few things. I was working with some founders recently. They were giving each other feedback, and one of the guys got the feedback and just went on this tear, trying to disprove the feedback. He was trying to prove it wrong. That was not received well. They started getting into a downward spiral. And if I take this through a communication lens, what failed? In that moment, we eventually got to it. What happened for him was, ouch. That feedback hurt. Ouch. But rather than saying that, frequently because it's too vulnerable to say that, because it feels risky to communicate the actual thing, he's now going to try and disprove the feedback. But once he goes, ouch, the other person goes, oh, that hurt. And they can actually have the conversation they really need to have. A second example of this that I learned a lot from in Conscious Leadership Group is, frequently people will ask questions of their close partners to mask what they want. The simplest version of this is usually it'll be like, hey, do you want to go out for dinner tonight? When really what's going on is, I want to go out to dinner tonight. Hey, do you want Italian food? Really what's going on is, I want Italian food. And these are simple, low-stakes example, but frequently there's a habit here of there's a way where I mask what's going on for me with a question or with something else, rather than just outing what you really want and what your agenda is. It's this theme of you're not right on communicating what's true for you. And the last example is, sometimes people will even misrepresent where they're coming from. Like, sometimes, I'm sure we've all been in a situation where somebody looking to go, hey, I'm curious. And then they'll start asking you a question. And the thing for me is, very frequently you can tell it's like, wait, you're not really curious. You have a different agenda. You're trying to disprove something. You're trying to dismantle something. You have a belief about me that you're trying to get to. Wouldn't it just be better to go, hey, it's not that I'm curious. It's, hey, I make up that you're XYZ ABC. And so we're talking very specifically verbal communication, but this ties into nonverbal too, which is we can sense when somebody's congruent with speaking what they really want to say from the place they're really saying it from. And so much of communication to me, when it's done effectively, is congruence. It's, are you really saying what you mean from the place that you mean it from?
I
Ricky, what
like
about
that.
you?
Yes, and I agree with everything that we're saying. I think the thing that's interesting here is a lot of what we're talking about is sort of like the root component. And I think that one of the things that we get wrong about communication is exactly what we're outlining here, right? We're sharing information not with actual authentic communication. Oftentimes we're moving around something, we're not thinking about who we're communicating with and who the audience is, and we're uncomfortable. And I think about communication as the real pitfalls that I think we run into a lot with communication. This has to do with partners and within work. Is oftentimes communication is paired with assumption making. So I say something and I assume we all have the same understanding, right? It's similar to the communication versus the perception that you were talking about, Corey, which is I communicated, I assume we're all on the same page, and therefore we are complete and it is done. When in fact, 9 times out of 10, we're not on the same page. What that results in is that because here's my other thing. The other thing that I think we really get wrong about communication is that from such a young age and through our entire lives, there's very rarely a lot of focus on communication in terms of how do we communicate with ourselves, with those around us, what are communication styles, right? Instead, we focus on, do I know what a metaphor is? Do I know a simile? These are the things that we focus on in terms of like writing, for example. But when we shift into communication as a really powerful tool, as one of the most powerful tools we have in terms of connecting with others, it's a very different skill set to think about it because I think we all talk all the time, so we think we're good at it. We're talking all the time, so we think we're good at it. It's like, have you ever been in a room with someone who just runs their fucking mouth, and by the end of it, you're like, I don't even know what the fuck you were trying to say. And that's one of the things I think we get wrong about communication often, is that very rarely do we recognize that communication, because it's something we do all the time, it's something that we also have to think about. In general, like a lot of us don't even think about the way we communicate, who we're speaking to. I want to go like even a step before. We think because I've been talking since I grew up, I'm fine. And if we aren't taking that extra time to do what Corey was describing, or Justin, what you were describing, ultimately we're sort of just shouting into the void and we're not honing it as a skill set. That's what I think we get wrong about communication.
There's an early point in what you said, Ricky, which to even zoom up when we're speaking about communication, there's actually 2 roles in communication. And I'm realizing my answer and most of our answers were primarily from your role as communicator, but inherently understanding that communication is always a 2-way street. We are not talking about you up on a soapbox projecting at somebody, but the actual act of communication, which is giving and receiving information accurately. There's another question here that I want to hear our answers to, which is, what do people get wrong about the listening part of communication? We primarily spoke from the communicating. What about the receiving part of communication?
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I'm sure that's huge, right? Because communication, if we're thinking about it as in terms of like soapbox, that's lecturing, that's educating, that's storytelling, that's influencing, right? Which I still think there's a component there to talk about in terms of leadership and how you navigate running what you do. But I think about it in terms of listening. We've probably, in this group, we've probably heard the phrase like active listening. If you haven't heard the phrase, it's fantastic. It's basically the idea of like, you're listening to listen. You are actively present and truly listening to what the person is saying. And I think that's important because we were talking a little bit about verbal and nonverbal communication, right? If I'm actively listening and I can see you, I'm listening to the words, the word choice, the tone. I'm listening to the way you're physically moving your body. And I'm listening not to speak, but only to listen. It's so hard for us to do this, right? When you're in a conversation and someone tells you something, you're already thinking about how you're going to answer. So that I can talk next. But when we focus in on being really present and actually really actively listening, it changes the dynamic. I learned this a lot when I was a suicide prevention counselor. This concept of active listening, rather than just to speak, it was, I'm going to listen to your word choice. I'm going to listen to your tone. If you tell me that you're happy, but your body positioning, your language sounds out of context with how you are, I can better understand what you're saying. Corey, I actually think the example that you gave with your partner of you saying something shitty and like saying it in a dickish way, and she was like, okay, that was dickish. That's an example of like really beautiful active listening, because she was like, I know you so well that I'm hearing your tone, I'm hearing the words, I can actually piece out what you're trying to tell me and call you out on it. I think a lot of us listen, we think we're listening, but our brain is somewhere else. We're already thinking about what we want to answer. Are you guys thinking about what you're going to answer right now?
I am
Always.
always half in
Right?
conversation. That's my default, though. It's a separate conversation.
It's its own thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's really hard to try to stay present and really truly listen.
So I actually had a note about active listening, so I'm glad you kind of queued it up. There are a lot of misconceptions about active listening. And like, I have been through formal therapy training programs. I have been through formal coaching certification programs, and we were taught, in air quotes, active listening in all of them. The issue, even from formal training programs, the way active listening is typically taught is basically listen to what the person says and then parrot back what they said. Either paraphrase what they said, or, and if you do this to me, because I've met a couple people who do this reflexively, and it just irritates the dog shit out of me. They will repeat the last 3 or 4 words that you said because they heard some fucking body language former FBI fucking person expert who's like, here's how you communicate with people and steer conversations. Just say the last 3 words and they'll think you've been listening the whole time. I'm not going to name names, but you could probably fucking Google it, who it is. But don't do that. That isn't active listening. That's just parroting. Like if I wanted somebody to parrot shit back to me, I'd either record my ass or buy a goddamn parrot. Okay? That isn't active listening. That's just parroting shit back. Active listening, like you said, Ricky, is listening. Like, most people listen with the intent to respond. They do not listen with the intent to understand. And especially like as coaches, when we are in a one-on-one setting or a dedicated setting, like the podcast is a little bit different because we each have points where we'll be making throughout the conversation. So it is a little bit, different or meta. But in a coaching setting, I don't really have anything else planned for that. Me personally, I don't have anything else planned for that session. Now, as you talk, I may write down notes real quick, but that is to help me actively listen to you because I'm forgetful as fuck, right? I am listening to fully understand not just what you say, but what you mean and what you aren't saying that maybe you aren't even aware of what's going on, right? Of like, you keep, so quick example. I was working with a client a while back, and they're basically like, hey, I feel like I need help with my ambition. And it's just like, you've built multiple companies, you're building another company. It doesn't really seem like ambition is your struggle. It sounds like conviction is. And what I mean by that is ambition tends to be outwardly focused. You're chasing other things, money, accolades, whatever. What you're actually saying you're struggling with is the thing you're currently building, you do not have a deep belief in intrinsically. Ambition is externally focused, typically. Conviction is internally focused. I deeply believe that this thing matters. So, and I checked, right? Because Rick, you said assumptions are the bane of conversation. I learned early on, don't make assumptions, make hypotheses and verify if that is accurate or not. So checking in with your client. So I said, how does that kind of land with you? And he was like, holy shit, that's exactly what I've been struggling with. You're right. Ambition isn't the word, but the fact that I was using this word was actually causing me to deviate from what I was actually trying to figure out. But now that I had this better term, conviction, now I have much more clarity on what I'm actually trying to achieve. Right. And then we kind of work from there in the coaching session. But that wasn't because I parroted back what he was saying. I was like, let me deeply listen to what the fuck you mean. Oh, there's a discrepancy between the words you're using and what you're actually trying to get at. And I only got that because I was deeply present in that moment. But yeah, like a lot of people don't do that. They make assumptions, they half listen just so they want to respond. But now you're responding based off of a false assumption you made that you never checked in with your audience with. And that's why communication is at the root of most conflict.
It's also, that was amazing, Corey. I'm with you for this whole thing. I was going to say in the parroting thing, it's also, there's this thing that happens that sometimes you say something and you're like, did you hear me? Did you hear me? And they repeat back to you what they said. It still doesn't mean they heard you. It just means they can repeat back to you what you said. Like it's like I memorized it and I regurgitated it to you. It does not mean that I am on the same page as you. It does not mean that I have internalized the information that you have shared with me. It means that I can repeat back to you what you have said to me. Drives me crazy.
So we're on the question of what we get wrong as listeners.
Mm-hmm.
A few things here. I have thoughts on active listening. I'm going to kind of save them for when we talk about how to do things well. I think one of the first things we do wrong, and by now our Enneagram episode will be out. And in the concept of Enneagram, there's this idea that frequently we all have listening filters on. So there are things that we specifically are listening for because we care about them, but it may not be that this is what the other person actually wants in this situation. This is actually one of the core parts of active listening in some of my trainings, which is actually listening for what do you most believe the other person wants in this now moment. But listening filters can really screw up our communication. The most common example is in heteronormative couples with a man or a woman. This is literally like the stereotype is that men tend to listen for what needs to be done, and women tend to listen for how the other person is feeling and what connection they may feel, right? And it's not that there's a right answer here, but you can literally see the game for like where the misfire happens. The man, okay, this is what needs to be done, so go do it. And meanwhile, she knows what needs to be done. She doesn't want you to go, here's what needs to be done. She wants somebody to go, hey, here's how I think you're feeling. Same thing, it misfires in the other direction. And I think the one of the skills I learned, Joe Hudson, Art of Accomplishment, Corey and I, you actually spoke about him recently a little bit.
You guys hanging out without me? You hanging out without me?
No, this was
you
in
hanging out without me?
This is in Corey's new coaching community.
Which Rick, if you'd be more active.
If you had entered into sooner, you would have taken part of the conversation.
Yes, okay. Shamed.
Sorry. But he has this mindset, Joe Hudson, optimized for connection, called view. The I, each letter there stands for something, and the I in view stands for impartiality. And impartiality means I'm not partial to how this conversation goes. Now, that's almost impossible to do. Really, as humans, it is impossible. But one of the big things that we go wrong when we're listening is we get partial about what's going on in a way that doesn't align with the other person's agenda for going on. Again, to go with this stereotypical example, it's like women more frequently, their agenda is, I just want somebody to really hear me and get me and go, it makes sense to me that you're feeling this way. Whereas a man's agenda is fix the problem as soon as possible. That's their partiality. They are uncomfortable sitting with undone things, so they go, here's what needs to be done. And again, the inverse, whereas the more heteronormative female pole is I wouldn't want to be here and have somebody not get how I'm feeling. And so they may be that way with somebody when really they just want to get things done. And so partiality and listening filters are two of the ways where I see listeners really get hooked up, because they're both not tuned into the whole of what somebody's saying, and they're not tuned into what is this person actually feeling and want in this moment.
I also think that, like, again, from both sides, not just like trying to focus on your own intentions versus how it's being delivered, but also the other person, right? So, for example, I, for lack of a better term, I am sensitive to disrespect. And what I mean by that is I quickly pick up on disrespect. Like, I'm not like, ooh, I'm sensitive. It's like I am aware. I have a heightened sense for this thing, right? Intended or not, right? So, whether that, comes from feeling like the third wheel sometimes, or like if you're the third friend and everybody's walking on the sidewalk, like, are you the one that has to like walk in the grass or like be behind the other two? Like, that was always me, right? Because I'm just like, I'll back off, right? Not to try to have an ego about it. I'll just back off. So if I am talking to you and during that conversation, you start talking to somebody else, or you just start looking away, or you do whatever, like, that is highly disrespectful, right? Um, and if that happens, I just kind of shut down, right? Whatever that means my attachment style is, I don't give a fuck. I'm not an attachment psychologist. I just shut down because I'm like, I am only going to go where I am respected and valued. Regardless of whether or not that's petty, I just, for my own value, that is what I do. Okay. However, I have a handful of friends who have like legit ADHD. So when I'm talking to them, I keep that in mind of like, this motherfucker is highly distractible by default. They do not mean for it to be disrespectful or dismissive. It's just how they're wired. So with them, I have that schema, that separate box of, they don't mean to be disrespectful when they do this. I just need to redirect them. But if I'm talking to somebody who isn't wired that way, I'm like, this motherfucker's just being disrespectful, right? Now that's an assumption I'm making, sure. And I have to keep that, within due bounds with that too, right? But I think that's another important caveat of really looking at, and this is where body language also the shit can be bullshit, is like really looking at, how does this person, what is their default? What are they intending to communicate, intentionally or unintentionally, by how they're engaging with this conversation? Because especially when you're talking about all the whole umbrella of neurotypicalness, or atypical, right? Neurodivergence. That is a very important piece to consider. Diagnosed or undiagnosable, doesn't matter. Just seeing what is this person's default mode of communication and interaction? How can I take that into account when I am communicating with them both ways?
I love that, because I think what it highlights too is that part of the thing that's tricky about communication is that it requires time and connection and understanding of the individuals that we're working with. If we want to be really effective in like, let's say one-to-one communication, which is sort of what I'm playing around with here. And that doesn't come on day one, right? We have people in our lives. Like, as you were talking, I was thinking, I was not listening. I was thinking about my own thing. No, I was listening. But my point is that there's people that we work with, right, that have different communication styles, different communication processes. So for example, my boo is a verbal external processor, which if we were going to ultimately always activate active listening, that would mean I'm listening to all the time to something that is actually just him working something out verbally. And I actually don't need to be in the conversation yet. I'm physically there, but like, I don't actually need to be actively listening, trying to jump in and be in because he's working something out and it happens to be external, the way that he verbally processes it. That is something that took us years to, we've been together for, I don't know, 11, 12 years. Like, it took me a long time to figure that out. And that's with my partner. That's my boo thing, that it took me that long to figure out. And even now, sometimes he'll start saying something and I'll have to say, oh, okay, wait, you're like figuring it out still. I will tap in when you're ready and I will be present and I will listen to you and we will have this conversation. But right now you're navigating your own thoughts and I'm kind of here for it. But that took years. And so when you play that out in like working with other leaders in your organization, or working with a new client, or working within any kind of space or a new friendship, it like Corey, you were talking about this, right? If I feel disrespected in the conversation and I know this person, right? It suddenly changes. If I know this person has some kind of diagnosis that means that they're easily distractible, I won't take it personally. But it took you time to know that about them. Whereas when you meet someone for the first time and they do that, and we might not know that, we might write them off. So I think that that's something that's really highlighting here for me, is that one of the benefits, one of the things that really up levels our ability to communicate is recognizing that communication styles, it takes time to learn how to communicate with an individual.
Well, but especially as coaches, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
going back to the meta point, right? Like of like behind the scenes of like how we coach and what goes into our coaching processes, right? Your fundamentally your job as a coach is to listen and ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
You can't ask effective questions if you're not actively listening, right? And effective communication requires psychological safety,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like a lot of times when I talk about like coaching skills and things, the things that I focus on for the fundamentals are building rapport, which is creating a sense of psychological safety, active listening, and asking open-ended questions. And they're inextricably linked because one requires the other two a lot of times. Like they all kind of are predicated on each other. As a coach, like that is your role of like, how can I make this person feel comfortable? One way to make them feel comfortable is to help them feel seen and heard and things through active listening and
Mm-hmm.
through asking these questions that show I'm fully present with them in a curious, supportive, non-judgmental way. Right. So fundamentally, as coaches, our jobs just kind of revolve around effective communication, one way or the other.
Yeah. And again, I also think it's really important to highlight that includes verbal and nonverbal, right? If someone tells you, like, I'm doing good versus I'm doing good, it's different, right? We need to, if we're going to be present in that conversation, we need to really be listening for those cues as well.
There's one more message here before we move on to whatever's next that I want to get, which is this is a big unlock I have when I'm working with co-founders and really applies to any partners. One thing that people really get wrong in communication is not communicating when they're unavailable for communication.
Oh, yeah.
And this goes back to emotional regulation and dysregulation. And I thought, well, I've noticed I do some of my best communication in my coaching sessions and with my partner and other things, but reliably. Why is it? Well, because I do a lot of work to, in that moment with that person, just my goal is to simply be available to them, to listen and to communicate to. I don't project much onto my coaching clients because I don't expect much from them. Whereas sometimes I may get more hooked in communication with Molly, who is my wife, because we get right. I have things I expect from her. I have things I want from her. She has a thing for me. And so a really important thing in communication, whether it's with a personal partner or just people who are important to you, is knowing, hey, I'm not actually available to listen to you right now. And in fact, you gave me that feedback. Ouch. If I communicate with you right now, all I'm going to be trying to do is disprove you. Is that really how we want this conversation to go? And so I think there's a real meta skill with communication, which is, am I authentically available to listen and communicate from presence, or am I dysregulated or activated in a way where I'm only going to listen for X and I'm only going to respond from Y? And this muscle, in my experience, takes a while to build, but once you build it, it's really powerful to go, hey, this is what I'm actually available for right now. Do we want to keep going? No, cool, pause. Let's come back when we're actually available to communicate.
You made me immediately think of, there's this great Brene Brown that she's telling a story about getting into a fight with her husband. And he basically is like, I think we need to cool off. And she's like, no, we're going to finish this fight right now. And that difference in communication styles, that he was basically saying, we like need a moment. And she's saying, no, like the way we do this is we fight through it. And I think there's a lot of power in recognizing that we can also say, hey, let's table this for tomorrow, right? We've all been in a meeting or a session or a situation that's starting to get hot, and we're starting to have responses that might be out of alignment with how we truly feel, but because we're getting caught up, that we're not able to be centered and have the conversation that we're trying to have in that moment because of our own shit that's coming to the table. There's huge power in that. I love that, Justin.
Well, another thing too is like this also applies to the work setting, but especially in relationships. I think we keep coming back to relationships just because those are the most universal example I think everybody can connect with. Is like, I'm a pretty stoic guy. Love stoicism, love Buddhism, love like practical philosophies that are intrinsically around emotion regulation and focusing on what is within your control versus what is without, right? However, that doesn't mean I am immune to negative emotions, right? Even though I may not necessarily express them. And when we talk about, like Justin kind of hinted at earlier, with like heteronormative, like stereotypes, right? When we think about stress and symptoms of stress, stereotypically, women tend to engage in internalized stress, which can cause you to cry and be emotional that way. Men tend to externalize their stress, which is, it looks like anger, right? So men are more likely to be aggressive, to break things, to yell, to get irritable, right? And it's just like,
Emotional. I'm going to call that emotional.
but the way it looks is very different, right? So one, learning to see how that can manifest, right? But the other thing is, I get highly irritable when I am stressed. Like that is how I express stress, right? Like I don't cry. I'm not like, oh my God. I'm like, I want to break shit. Um, so sometimes I will go downstairs and I'll tell Rochelle, like, hey, I am super stressed today. I'm just letting you know this in advance that I do not in any way intend to be irritable at you, but irritability may come in your direction. I'm going to do everything I can to stay on top of it, but I'm just communicating to you in advance that if I do anything that might come across as I'm being irritable at you, I will do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen. But if it does, please understand it is not a you thing. It is not a conflict with us. It is purely my own shit I am trying to work on today. Right. That helps. Right. And again, like it's never going to be her fault that I'm irritable. Right. I'm communicating. I don't want you to think it is something you have done. Right. And then I'm like, I'm communicating my emotional needs. What I need is to be left the fuck alone to self soothe. I am not the kind of person who, when I am stressed, I need you to be in my face. That will overwhelm me, right? I need to be left the fuck alone. But if I am with somebody who, when they are stressed, they don't want to be left alone. If I think, well, I self soothe through isolation, they must self soothe the same way. Well, now they might feel abandoned, right? So that really comes back to this whole communication thing too, of like communicating your own needs, but also recognizing the other person's needs at the same time and making sure you are communicating your support through whatever the fuck they need, right? You can communicate support through leaving them the fuck alone or through hugging them or doing some other, more active type thing, right? Um, I'll stop there for now. I have another point, but I'll wait.
Two things that I'm just going to throw out. Justin, is that okay? I have two things to throw out. I don't know. You got something to say? I got something to say. Okay. Two things. One, having a 4-month-old, so hearing the word self-soothe makes me laugh because I'm like, would you like a pacifier? Do you need a snack? Not you, the rhetorical you, just like it's hilarious because I'm living the life of please sleep longer. But one thing that triggered for me in this conversation also is around one of the pitfalls and one of the things that we get wrong around communication is oftentimes avoiding communication that is effective because we are uncomfortable with what we are trying to share. And that's also a major thing that we get wrong. So let's see, a leader is communicating ineffectively because they are uncomfortable with the information that they have to share. And that could look like skirting around it, putting all this gloss, lipstick on a pig. And that is something that I think also is a pitfall that we get in communication. I grew up in a house. Oh God, did my parents listen to this? I don't think so. I grew up in a house that I often learned the power of the white lie. The white lie, which as I've aged, the white lie is just something to kind of fucking lie to everybody to make them feel more comfortable. But it's avoiding possible conflict. It's a very passive approach in the experience that I had as a child, right? It was like rather than telling someone that you don't want to go to their birthday party, you're going to lie and say you're busy. And it became just ingrained in me that that is an okay thing to do because I don't want to hurt that person's feelings, right? And that has been something that I have spent so much time working against, which is the white lie to communicate ineffectively with a lot of like softness around it that's not actually getting to the root of the conflict or the conversation that we need to have. We're instead kind of dancing around it, but we're still communicating. That's something that we get wrong all the fucking time when it comes to communication, right? Like it's similar to, or it's a more advanced example of, do you think we should go out for dinner? It's different if I say, do you think we should go out for dinner? And then I'm kind of dancing around it. Whereas if instead I'm very honest and I'm like, dude, I want to go out for dinner today. Can we go out for dinner? Are you down? That's very different, right? And the reason why we avoid it is because it forces us to be in a position of kind of owning our space, of being honest with ourselves and the people around us about something that might make them uncomfortable. So I don't want to go to your birthday party because I don't like that guy and they're going and it's okay. And I support you on having the birthday party, but like, I'm just not comfortable being in the same place as them. I don't need you to change anything. I want you to still have the birthday party. Let's go have dinner ourselves on another day, right? Instead, we usually just lie. And what that does is that it creates disconnect in the communication. I think about it at work. How often in a workplace do people kind of do a white lie, or they communicate ineffectively because they don't actually want to talk about like, well, what really happened? I just had this the other day. That someone, they relate to a session with me. And I messaged them and I said, hey, I'm here. I'm in the Zoom. You're running about 5 minutes late. Here's the link. Like if you need me. And they were like, 20 minutes later, they were like, I've been in the Zoom this whole time. They hadn't. I get a notification in Zoom when someone joins. I knew that they hadn't. But they did the lie because it made us all feel better, right? They were like, I don't want to admit the fact that like I was late and I forgot and I wasn't paying attention. So I just said, I've been here this whole time. And that's an example of, I think, where we get a little tripped up in communication is when we are communicating ineffectively in order to protect ourselves or others.
With that point, I think we've all had this situation where you are in a conversation with somebody and you know for a fact you can't trust them. So you're both having a false conversation. I and most people I know will instantly have significantly more respect for you and trust in you when you say, hey, I fucked up and totally forgot about this. It won't happen again. I have no excuses. Because what you have proven is you have integrity enough to own your shit. That outweighs one time you being late or fucking up. But if you said, I've been here the whole time, what you have communicated, whether you intended to or not, is that you're full of shit. And
You're a
I
liar.
don't fuck with people who are full of shit. I fuck with people with integrity. You can fuck up. We all fuck up. But own your shit and have integrity. Communicate that you have integrity. But that is a really important point. A lot of people fear conflict. And because they fear conflict, they lie because they think that avoids conflict. The issue is communication isn't conflict. A lot of people think if and this relates to setting healthy boundaries and a lot of other episodes we've already done, right? People who identify as being averse to conflict tend to struggle with effective communication because part of effective communication is also setting healthy boundaries and communicating those boundaries. I can communicate something to you without it turning into a confrontation, such as a fight or an argument. But if I assume if I communicate effectively to you, you're going to get aggressive or it's going to turn into a type of conflict, then I am going to reflexively not communicate effectively. And then problems will continue or they will be created and all these downstream effects of that. Right. And then now nobody trusts me because I'm full of shit, or I am resentful because I never communicate my boundaries, or I never stand up for myself in a meeting, or all these other things, right? Again, like really looking at my question to you, dear viewer slash listener, is really it basically interrogating your own beliefs and assumptions around communication and what it means to communicate. Because I think we all have our own definitions of what communication is and the repercussions of effectively communicating. And if one of my assumptions is if I effectively communicate what I actually want or need or whatever, people will judge me. People will get aggressive with me. I could get fired. I could lose this relationship. That's really, really important for you to really flesh out and really examine one, the truth, the validity of it, but two, the consequences of continuing to hold that belief.
The next question is the question that we're expecting, right? Which is around what, and we're starting to already pepper it in. But before I get to it, which the next question is like, how can we be better at communication? Which is probably our closing question, as it often is. I want to ask, because I have some stuff, is there anything about communication that we didn't dive into, that we didn't cover, that triggered for us that we want to share?
Sure. What I typically start with in most conversations. So again, like when I was in grad school, I had a friend who was a couple years ahead of me, and he was like, "Look, the biggest thing that people struggle with, and again, this was with therapy, but it applies to coaching." He was like, "The biggest thing people struggle with is they make assumptions rather than making hypotheses." He was like, "So when you have this idea, you're like, oh, I think they mean this, or I think this is what the problem is." Rather than making that assumption and just going off of it, just check in with them. Like, hey, I think this is it, or hey, is this accurate? Is this what you mean? And then they can say yes or no. If they say yes, cool. Now you're all on the same page and you move on. If they say no, well, now they've corrected you and now you're both there. And what that is getting at, and this is where I start most of my conversations, is operationally defining what you mean, what the goal of that conversation is, and just where your starting point is, right? So with anybody, when somebody says something, typically what I start with, I'm like, okay, so by that, do you mean X? Or before we go into this conversation, let's define this term, right? So my example earlier with ambition, like, hey, let me share my definition of what ambition is, and then let me share my definition of what conviction is and how they differ. What are your thoughts on this? Because then my client could have said, actually, my definition of ambition is this thing over here. Cool. We were operating from different definitions. And had we not known that, we would have actually been having different conversations throughout from that moment on. But now that we have agreed, we have operationally defined the terms we're using in this conversation, we know we're both using the same term with the same meaning. That's one of the biggest struggles I see a lot of people have is they never think to ask, is my definition their definition, vice versa?
Yeah, I love that. One of the main things I've written down was just don't assume. It's like, stop assuming things. It makes an ass out of you and me. That phrase holds. And I think it's okay to have, like, this is what I'm hearing, but assumptions are so dangerous when it comes to communication because we're not having that opportunity to ensure that we're on equal footing, that we're truly hearing each other, that we're also understanding intention, right? What's underneath the surface? You said this, but is that really what you're intending for me to understand? I think that's big. What were you going to say, Justin?
There's a nuance here around this point around don't assume. Um, like if we get really stupid about it, it's like, well, whenever we're communicating, we're always assuming. I cannot pause to ask you the meaning of every single word or every single thing you're saying. And so this core skill comes back to listening because Corey, what I make up happened there is like for you, there was a detector. You were listening in such a way, even as you were speaking, where there was like a wiggle in you that was like, oh, we might not be talking about the same thing here. And so there's like another communication skill here around this don't assume, which is, hey, we actually kind of have to make a bunch of assumptions. So the skill is, can you listen to when there's like a wiggle here that's going, hey, we might not be talking about the same thing. And I think there's that comes back down to, again, active listening, and also listening while you communicate. This is another thing that's kind of weird, but there's a way where you can, as you're communicating, somebody is communicating back to you with the reactions and how they're receiving it. And so you have to both be able to have your communicator and your listener on at the same time to notice, oh, did they reacted in a way that maybe indicates they're not getting me right now, or they're not understanding what I'm saying, and coming back to it. And this is the core skill, I think, again, of like active listening. It's listening for, like you said before, Ricky, literal words. Then there's listening for meaning. What do you think they actually mean by their words? Then there's listening for feeling. What are they actually feeling right now? And then there's also listening for wanting. What do I think they actually want here right now? And so, then there's probably other categories in here. You all have probably been trained on some, but those are some of the better ones I know of, to be like, it is really the fundamental skill of communication is tuning into yourself and tuning into them as deeply as possible. And when you're in the smooth groove of conversation and it's like, okay, I think we're getting each other, riding the groove, and noticing when you fall out of the groove and going, okay, we just fell out here. What happened? Here's what I think happened. What do you think happened there?
Agreed.
Yes. I love that. I love that nuance around the wiggle. I love a wiggle. So we're talking about the wiggle. We're talking a little bit about active listening, right? Assumption and thinking through these things. What else can we tell our folks as they're considering paying attention to their communication?
In what context?
In any context, Corey. I don't care. Anything. What do you think will help them?
I think watching really good podcast interviewers is like one of those like weird things that is super helpful. I don't mean like your typical podcast, person who just asks random fucking questions, or they already know the answers to everything, or they're asking the person the exact same questions the person's been asked 100 other times. I mean people who do deep research, are very good at making somebody feel very comfortable. A couple people that come to mind if you want to check out other podcasts. Danny Miranda, he's awesome. His podcast is really good. Danny's really, really good. And he's actually started coaching recently, which is super cool to see. Danny's really good at building rapport and listening to like a level that is beyond most people. Most coaches and psychologists I know, like Danny's is absolutely phenomenal with it. I would definitely like watch, not just listen, but like watch Danny do it, like watching his body language, watching how like he leans in certain times, but also really observing how he asks questions. He's a really good person to look at. You can't watch it because they don't video it, but you can still listen. Dax Shepard of Armchair Expert. Dax is super, super good at Dax's whole thing is Dax is in recovery and he loves the intimacy of an AA meeting. And he was like, I kind of wanted a podcast that had a similar feel to where we could have deep conversations and people felt psychologically safe. And we could go into like deep conversations that typically these people don't share publicly. Dax is phenomenal at very quickly helping you feel very supported, very heard, seen, all those things, so that you're much more willing to talk about, all of your past and things. Those are the two people I would probably look at first from my own experiences that have a very, very high level of communication, building rapport, active listening, asking open-ended questions, and just being fully present in the moment to the point that you feed off of their energy, and just being in the room with them is a positive experience from the beginning.
Yeah. I'll throw in Pete Holmes too. He does a good job. And Brene Brown.
I'm still kind of struggling, I think, with the just like breadth of the topic of communication.
I
And
know.
I think I'm trying to zoom out too much. So I'm just going to throw some tools that come to mind when I think of communication. I'm going to stop trying to be so big with it in my mind. Um, Probably two of the most useful tools that I find. Now, let me say something about communication, which goes back to the point I said earlier, which is fundamentally any communication tool can is just a tool. It's just a tactic. And for me, the more important thing with communication is where are you actually congruent with what's true for you and where it's coming from. And so there's a way where you can take these things as tools and use them in your tool belt and still actually be communicating in the exact same way and getting the exact same results because you actually haven't shifted the underlying place that you're communicating from. So, actually, this leads me to start. So, I mentioned earlier view, which is something that Joe Hudson teaches. And again, view is inherently viewed to be a mindset, not a set of tools. So view is, again, where are you coming from? And what view stands for is vulnerability, impartiality, empathy, and wonder. And so one really way, if you want to communicate in a way that optimizes for connection, is to embrace view. What vulnerability here means, vulnerability is speaking the truth even when and especially when it's scary to speak that truth. Empathy is, or actually impartiality is, again, not having an agenda, or really it's outing your agenda when it shows up. Empathy is being with whatever emotions show up, not trying to fix them, not taking them on, but just going, oh, so there's you're feeling frustrated. Okay, frustration is welcome here. And wonder is just sitting in the awe of a question. And so one way, if you really want to up the connection in your communication, is to go through each of these things when you're conversing with somebody. What's the most vulnerable thing I could say right now? What's the vulnerable truth? Is there a scary truth or a scary question here that I'm not going to? Do I have a strong agenda for how this conversation goes? And am I willing to out that agenda to make sure we're aligned? And that's actually how we want to be communicating. Empathy, is there a feeling that's starting to come up in me or this other person that I'm uncomfortable with, and when I run away from it, it's going to ruin or change the course of the conversation? And wonder, what am I authentically wondering about right now? Again, authentically, because there's a way where you can pretend like you're wondering but not really wondering. And so view is a really great thing. They have a course called the Connection Course. They also have a bunch of podcast episodes that you can plug into that are really good for those. The other thing that's been really helpful for me is they're very similar. Some people will call it nonviolent communication. Others will call it unarguable communication. I prefer the term unarguable communication. And it's speaking of everything in an unarguable way. And normally it is, I noticed, I feel, I'm having the thought, I'm making up the story. So always speaking from your experience of something rather than generalizing or throwing out truths that can't be true. This would be the difference between like, hey, Corey, you were being a dick when you said that. Or, hey, Corey, I experienced the way you said that as being kind of dickish. There's a way where you were being a dick when I said that. We could debate that. Corey could go, well, I wasn't being a dick. That wasn't. But if I say I experienced that as being dickish, we actually can't argue it. It's my experience. And then Corey could go, oh, well, that wasn't my intention. And suddenly we're talking about our inarguable experiences rather than having an argument about whether or not it was dickish. And inarguable speech is a really powerful thing. Now, the way to really do inarguable speech is from the place of 100% responsibility, which is actually, there's a way where I could go to Corey, hey, I experienced that as being dickish. And what I'm really saying is, I think you're a dick. Versus going, hey, I don't actually know if you did that. I may have created that with my own sensitivities and listening filters, but just so you know me, I experienced that as being dickish. And so similar to view with inarguable communication, the place to really come from that is 100% responsibility. Here's my experience. I'm not saying you created it. I created it in some ways, but I want you to know my experience. These tools are really effective, I think, for optimizing for communication that allows for connection and vulnerability. And like I started with, to talk about the real thing.
I love that. I hadn't heard that before. That was like, boom, boom. That did that to my brain. That's
Yeah, View is
awesome.
really cool. The connection course is a great tool. So if you have some budget and you want to go into it, um,
Good to know.
there's a lot in that. If you're a coach and you're listening, my experience of View is, throughout coaching, you learn these different coaching archetypes. View is really excellent for coaching truly from coach, which is what Corey said, which is just asking really good questions. View is a really good mindset to like really tune into somebody and go, ooh, what's the vulnerability? What are they feeling? What's the good question here?
Nice. I'm going to go very tactical, like deep, deep, deep tactical, because I feel like right now we're getting very beautiful context around like the way to a little bit more around the mindset and the space around it. So I have a couple things that I'll offer up that are very, very tactical. One is contrasting. Crucial Conversations. It's a book. It's about having tricky, difficult conversations when the heat is hot. There's some stuff that's good in it. There's some stuff that's not great in it. But the thing that I loved that I take with me and use really often is contrasting, which is in many ways, it's almost trying to set the stage and remove some of the potential assumption. And what that looks like is what I don't want you to think is what I don't want you to think is happening is X, but I want to talk about Y. And what that looks like, let's say, for example, I'm trying to get a promotion, right? And that can come up with a lot of heat when we're going to promotion discussions because, are we saying that like, if you don't promote me, I'm quitting? Are we saying that like, I'm unhappy? Are we saying that like, I'm feeling not super focused about this and it's like, whatever. So that might look like what I don't want you to think is I'm not happy here. And at the same time, I'd like to have a discussion around potential for promotion because I feel like XYZ. So it can take some of the hot air out of the room, right? So like, for example, you're talking to your partner and you're saying, what I don't want you to think is that I'm angry about the situation. And at the same time, I want to talk about when you said this, can we dive in? It basically helps set the stage a little bit. Now, there's still going to be assumption. We're still going to have to work through that complexity, but it can be really helpful to ease some of the internal discomfort around having a potentially difficult conversation. So contrasting. Yeah. Oh no, Justin.
Now, I just want to say the important thing about this tool, again, is from where you're coming from, is you have to actually mean the first thing.
Oh,
So
yes.
I don't want you to think I'm angry about this will not work if underneath the surface
If I'm
you're
actually
still
angry.
angry about it.
Yes.
So
Oh,
notice
that's such a good point.
because leaders will deploy this as a tactic. They'll come up and they'll go to say, they'll be pissed at an employee and they'll start the conversation with, I don't want you to think I'm angry about this, but we need to, like, I want to have a conversation on how we can work on it. And it's like, no, you're still angry. You, as Ricky said before, you lied, you're not saying the vulnerable thing, and it's going to derail it. So you have to make sure you're actually grounded in the truth of what you're speaking.
Yes. It's the same in the promotion conversation. If I'm actually unhappy at work, then I'm fucking lying in that conversation. I mean, it might be a tactic that we're leveraging in this space, but ultimately, I'm not going to have a good discussion with my manager if they don't understand that I actually am unhappy if we aren't able to get a promotion and or additional responsibility. So yes, that's a great point, Justin. My two others, I have two more. One is if you're in a leadership position, you are not communicating enough. You need to communicate more. You need to communicate so many fucking times that you are sick of hearing yourself speak about it and they are sick of hearing you speak about it. The statistics on communication, especially in leadership, are trash. Trash. Trash, 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 trash. And if you've worked in a corporate setting, you know this, right? If you're a leader or if you're not a leader, you've seen it from both sides. As a leader, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm doing a great job. 75% of leaders say they're doing a good job at communicating. And like 80% of employees say they're not. There's a crazy disconnect. And part of it has to do with repetition. And so this is a weird tactic, but if you're a leader, you should say it a million times. I still think about this when it comes to the work that we sometimes do, right? If we're promoting something. Do we promote it just once? Fuck no. Right? if I want to share something that I have that I want people to be aware of and to engage with, I'm going to have to repeat myself a couple different times in a couple different ways. So that's my second one. And my last one, because you guys have already shared such beautiful things, is put your phone down when you're in conversation. We're really bad at it. We're really bad at it. We're really bad at being super present in the conversation. But if you've ever had the experience that you're talking to someone and they pull out their phone because they got a notification and it's a fucking bullshit notification and suddenly they're taken away from the conversation, that connection that we've been building is gone. So if you're going to have or planning to have really authentic connection and communication with someone, turn the phone over. It doesn't need to be there. Those are my very tactical ones because I feel like the two of you had some very beautiful, like more higher level in terms of intention and that stuff. That's what I got. What else y'all got? Y'all got something else that you want to share to the class?
I can kind of end on this as my parting words.
Mm.
When it comes to communication and specifically practicing conversation, right? Everybody hates small talk. Some people claim to like it. I claim to believe that they're full of shit. But I love the concept of niche talk, which is different than small talk. Okay, small talk is whatever political drama, social media drama, the fucking weather, whatever. I don't give a fuck about small talk. Now, the other side of that is people like, oh, I hate small talk. Tell me about your traumas the first time we fucking meet. Like, that's too much. Pump the fuck up. Like, not every conversation has to be an existential crisis of a conversation. Okay. Well, when I was little, this happened to me. Like, motherfucker, like, because I get that shit all the time because I'm a psychologist. I'm like, I'm not your fucking therapist, bro. Like, I don't need to know that. I don't care to know it. I legitimately don't give a shit. Right. But I'm an asshole. You don't have to do that. So it isn't this thing of like either you talk about the weather or you talk about your fucked up childhood or something. There's a middle ground. And that is what I call niche talk. So anytime I meet somebody and I'm like, okay, I'm specifically, because I got enough friends, I don't really give a shit about meeting new people most of the time. But again, I'm an asshole. But when I'm specifically hanging out with people, I'm like, I'm just going to, maybe I'm feeling, whatever, peppy, and I want to make a new friend. Or if I'm like, I got to be here, I might as well, and I can't just sit in a corner because I'll look like a fucking serial killer. Let me do conversation. Let me practice communication. I will find a niche thing that you are interested in, and we'll talk about that, right? It doesn't have to be a shared interest, right? Like if I see you got cauliflower ear, we'll talk about grappling. If I see you with a jiu-jitsu shirt, 100% we're going to talk about jiu-jitsu. If I see you with a D&D shirt, 100% we're going to talk about D&D. But if I find out that you really like, I don't know, collecting fucking stamps or some shit, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to practice my communication skills with this motherfucker who likes stamps. Cool. I'm going to be fully in that conversation. And because I'm like, I don't know, fuck all about stamps. I would love to see stamp collecting through your eyes. So let me actively listen. Let me ask these open-ended questions. Let me create this sense of connection with you because conversation is about connection. How can I connect with you? Right? So if you're wanting just a way to practice your communication, what you're actually asking is, how can I practice connecting with people faster, better, and on a deeper level? You don't have to do small talk. You don't have to fucking trauma dump. You can find a thing someone is interested in and talk to them about that. You can do that every single day of your life. And every single time you do it is a rep helping you get better at communication and connection. We're
And you
talking
get to
about a
learn,
tactical thing.
and you get to learn a lot about stamps.
Yeah.
Such a win at the end there. Who doesn't want to talk about stamps? I love that, Corey. Friends, do we have any other last parting words? Thanks for getting in this with me. The main reason I wanted to talk about this, I think, is because I love acknowledging that if we were all more effective communicators, rom-coms could not exist. You know? And that's why we're talking about this, because I fucking love a rom-com. But 5 minutes in, you're like, if they would just fucking talk to each other, the movie would be over. So here we are. We good, friends? Corey, take us out.
Toodles.